From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to Chicago Newsroom. Today is April 5th. It's the 95th day of 2018, and according to the most recent statistics that we can find, 422 human beings have been shot with a firearm in Chicago so far this year. And of those, it appears that somewhere around 108 have died from those bullets that were shot from a firearm. Superintendent of Police Eddie Johnson had a press conference 4 days ago, and he announced that gun deaths in Chicago are finally on the decline and have been for the past 13 months. Compared with last year, when we had 140 gunshot deaths on this date, this year's 108 is something of a decline, and for that we can all be grateful. But it's also worth reporting that Chicago currently has approximately 2,250 sworn police officers, and that's up maybe a couple hundred or so from a year ago. And at the present time, the Chicago Police Department's budget is around $2 billion, depending on how you count it, which means that depending on how you calculate it, policing in Chicago consumes about a quarter of our budget. It's also worth mentioning that Mayor Emanuel has cleared the way for a construction of a $95 million training facility for Chicago's police and fire. Now, it's not a secret that relations between police and our citizens are often tense, and the police have been criticized pretty much forever for insensitive or unfair policing tactics in some communities. You could fill libraries with the various reports that have been written on the subject, but a little more than a year ago, two particularly scathing reports about Chicago police landed, one from the federal government and one from a task force created by the mayor himself. And they both returned long lists of urgent demands for radical changes in how the department's managed and how the department is run. Today, we're going to take a look back at those reports and do a few other things too, but mainly we're going to ask if the administration is making any progress on police reform. And we're also going to take into consideration that the city is currently involved in a long, difficult process with the police and the police unions to hammer out a contract. Needless to say, all of these efforts, the police reform and the police contract, they're very deeply intertwined and often at odds with one another. Lori Lightfoot knows something about that. She's been chair of the Chicago Police Board since 2015 and was recently reappointed to the post by Mayor Emanuel and was a member of the aforementioned Police Accountability Task Force. And she's been on this show a few times, and we are really happy to have you back again.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you. A detailed and lengthy introduction, but it's needed because of the complexity here. Could we start 2 weeks ago on Election Day, I believe it was. The media was probably occupied elsewhere. But in court, Mayor Emanuel's forces told the judge that they would be willing to have the ACLU and Black Lives Matter and a number of other community organizations join them in their pursuit of a consent decree about revising the police department, which is a change because they were pursuing their own legal processes in the court. They dropped that to join in. Am I
not quite?
No? Okay. No. Well, nevertheless, am I right or wrong to feel optimism that this was a big move that might be helpful?
It's definitely a big step, but I mean, in some ways, a predictable step. So just to set the context, the group known as the Campbell Plaintiffs, that includes Black Lives Matters, includes the Chicago Urban League, and a number of other community-based organizations, were the first to sue the city to try to force changes in the police department and compel the entry into a consent decree. I believe that that case was filed in late June or early July of 2017.
So this is after the DOJ report comes out and your report comes out.
Our report came out almost 2 years ago, April of 16. DOJ report comes out in the middle of January 17. Right. There's this period where there's a lot of uncertainty. In June, the mayor announces that he's entered into a memorandum of agreement with the Jeff Sessions Department of Justice, which turns out not to quite be so. A number of us, and me included, comes out and says the memorandum of agreement is fatally flawed. It's not going to provide the kind of change that's necessary or give the tools to the superintendent that was necessary. Soon thereafter, the Campbell plaintiffs file suit. That is then followed in late August of last year by the Illinois Attorney General filing its own lawsuit. And at the day that the lawsuit's announced, there's that strange press conference with the mayor, the superintendent, and Lisa Madigan saying, I've just sued you, but we're going to be partners, which is kind of a very strange notion. And then in, I believe, September, the ACLU then brought a third lawsuit.
So the ACLU suit drops after the Lisa Madigan announcement. Okay.
So what happened then on Election Day was there was an announcement that the Campbell plaintiffs and the ACLU have entered into a memorandum of agreement with the city and the Illinois Attorney General's office to effectively give them a formal process by which to affect the content of the consent decree, to give specific channels for feedback, but to reserve their right to continue their lawsuit if they feel either that the consent decree isn't going the way that they think it should, or that even after the consent decree is entered, a way to challenge it in court. So their lawsuits are, we call that legally on a stay. They've decided to put their lawsuit on hiatus, not pursue any of the legal remedies that they would otherwise be entitled to.
They're not dead, but they're just kind of like a hold.
They're in a holding pattern pending their participation in a process by which they give feedback to the city of Chicago and the Illinois Attorney General's office on changes in the consent decree. Now, an important difference, though, is they have not consolidated their cases. They haven't joined the lawsuit that was been brought by the Attorney General's office. Those two separate lawsuits remain, but they have entered into a formal process for conversation. So that's progress.
Okay, so the big question at this point, I guess, is what is it that they're attempting to do? I mean, this consent decree, if it could ever happen, what would it be and what would it do?
Well, ideally what it would do is define, think of it in kind of three parts. Ideally, in the first instance, what the consent decree would do is define very specific policy objectives that the department and the city are agreeing to, with accompanying timelines on when they were going to get it accomplished. It would certainly cover things like training. It's going to cover things like accountability, discipline, and a range of other things, probably drawing from the recommendations of both the DOJ and the task force. That's really important because the specifics and the timelines are what then the second piece of the consent decree, that's the monitor. The monitor is going to be auditing whether or not the department and the city are meeting the obligations that they agreed to in the first instance, and are they doing it in the time frame that they have agreed to.
Okay.
So the specifics drive the scope of what the monitor's activities will actually be.
Now, you've just introduced this new concept of monitor.
Yes.
This is a human being? This is an
It'll
individual?
be probably more than one human being, but it'll be a team, likely, led by a particular person. And that team's responsibility is to audit progress towards the goals and the specifics that are set in a consent decree, and to the extent that there's not progress made, to throw the red flag, to bring the parties together, to figure out how they cure the problem. And then the third piece of it is, if there's a breach of the agreement, if the department and the city are not fulfilling the obligations that they agreed to, if the notice has been given and they still haven't cured the problem, the agreement has to allow for enforcement then by the federal court. So it's a three-legged deal, but it's really driven by specifics, timelines. And what I hope to also see in the consent decree is specific financial commitments on the part of the city and personnel to make it happen. Both are going to be needed. As it stands right now, the department is not going to be able to drive the changes that are necessary without a specific funding commitment and also without additional personnel that are subject matter experts to help drive the change.
I mean, the police
internally.
department would not be able
Correct.
to do this.
Correct.
All right, so the judge, the federal judge, has this array of people in front of him who come to some kind of an agreement, and they hammer out a decree of some kind, a consent decree that says, we've agreed that there have to be 11 changes to the Chicago Police
Right.
Department. We've agreed that that's going to cost $71 million, and here's the check.
Or paid over time.
Paid over time,
Yes.
right. So let's get started.
Yep.
And the police department, can the police department object in any way, or do these things have to be done?
No, when by the time it gets to the point that a presentation is made to the court of here's our consent decree, and look, the judge is probably going to hold hearings to give the public, frankly, an opportunity to weigh in. And what the Attorney General has said is that before they present the consent decree to the court, they're going to put it out there for public comment, and then they will take the feedback that they receive and hopefully make whatever changes are necessary based upon that feedback. But once the deal is done, the department can't object because they will have agreed on the front end as a party to the lawsuit.
Is the Chicago Police Department one of the people sitting at the table? I mean, are
Yes,
they part
no,
of hammering
no,
out the...
no question
So
whatsoever.
it's not being done to them.
No.
It's something that everybody has agreed to do.
There's a
and
team
now-
of people within a department, there's a team of people in the mayor's office and the law department that are working together to represent the city interest in these negotiations with the Attorney General's office.
This all sounds so magnificent. It sounds wonderful. I can't wait for it to happen, and I can't wait to be there when they cut the ribbon on the new Chicago Police Department. However, the cynic in me says, each of these parties, the police department, the ACLU, a number of other organizations, and the city, and the unions, they all have very different perspectives on
Yes.
this. How in the world are you going to herd all of these? These are not kittens. This is herding,
Saber-toothed
violently.
tigers.
Yes, saber-toothed tigers and bears all together in the same thing. How does that work? Can it be done?
It can be done. It's been done in cities across the country. But there's got to be leadership. There's got to be an acceptance that the status quo can't remain. And there's got to be, there's going to be horse trading, to be sure. The union, the primary union, the biggest union, the Fraternal Order of Police, has kind of staked out a position of no to everything, objecting to everything. Now, you alluded to this in the opening, but the other thing that's out there is the collective bargaining agreements have all expired.
Right.
So what they're primarily looking at is how is this consent decree process going to affect the things that we value
Yeah.
and are important to us in a collective bargaining agreement?
And I want to
if-
make sure that that in our little consent decree show here today, we set aside some time so we get to understand what those
Sure.
issues are.
Sure.
Because I think that often gets kind of overlooked in
Yeah.
these conversations.
No, it's a critical part of the calculus, and frankly, the union's position to date is predictable, but so also disappointing. But they're going to have a seat at the table. My sense is they are getting regularly consulted by the police department and the city, and frankly, I think the AG's office to try to bring them along and make sure that they are getting their due, that they're having opportunities to give feedback all along the process. Now, that's not going to stop them at the end of the day of saying, "Oh, this is pick your purple adjectives," but there is a process and a consciousness of making sure that the unions are part of the process. And I hope, frankly, that they recognize that it's actually in their members' best interest to be part of the solution.
Well, that's a critical piece of this.
It is. I mean,
if
look,
that buy-in can happen.
The bottom line is you're not going to be able to make the kind of fundamental cultural change if the union is not a willing participant
Yeah.
in those changes. We've had success historically, despite the back and forth of getting the union to see that it's actually in their members' best
Yeah.
interest. I think the jury's out on this current leadership because they're kind of the party of no right now. But some of that clearly is posturing, given that the collective bargaining agreements have expired and they know that some kind of change is coming. But they need to be willing participants and not drug kicking and screaming.
Well, I mean, you said a couple of nights ago to Carol Marine that the FOP, the Federation of Police, has delegitimized itself every day by fighting progress on things like body cameras, use of force regulations, and that kind of thing. So you are you're already staking out a position here too.
Well,
that
I'm clearly disappointed in the way in which they have conducted their business. I just think that it's wrong-headed. I don't think it supports their members. You know, I have regular contacts with members of the department, line officers who I know, who are friends, and I think they want to be supported. And if you actually look at a consent decree process, while it is burdensome, no doubt, while it is costly, no doubt, ultimately, if it's done right, and there's no reason why it can't be in this city, it transforms the department and inures to the benefit of the officers. It gives them better training, better tools, creates avenues for better relationships with the community, which is critically important. Police can't be effective if the community doesn't view them as a legitimate force. And so those things can happen through the consent decree. So just reflexively fighting it, as FOP has, at least to date, staked out the position, ultimately doesn't benefit their members. It just doesn't.
Their statement the other day was just a couple of sentences. As it is, the consent decree is a tremendous waste of resources for the city and the state that will diminish the ability of officers to protect the public. The ACLU has proven particularly adept at increasing crime with their reforms rather than truly protecting the people, and then they go on to attack you personally.
Predictable.
This is not...
That's wrong-headed, and frankly, again, if they really believe that says that they have done absolutely no research on best practices of police departments, done no research on what the actual effects of consent decrees can do. For example, Los Angeles Police Department is now, I think, widely viewed as really the gold standard in policing. Now, I know New York would take issue with that. But part of the reason for that is because they went through a very tough consent decree process, but the leadership of the department, the leadership of the city, decided to use that as an opportunity to really transform the quality of policing, the quality of the relationship with the community. And no police department is perfect, but they came out of that process far better than they were before, and frankly, really providing the support and resources that their officers deserve in an organization where your primary asset is your people. We can do that in Chicago and frankly go one better. So the union's reflexive, it's a waste of money. Well, I'll tell you what's a waste of money: spending $50 and $60 million every single year on settlements and judgments related to police misconduct. Not only is that an outrageous abuse of taxpayer dollars, it also undermines the legitimacy of every single officer on the beat who's trying to do his or her job the right way. So the union doesn't talk about that. They and if they do, they just say, oh, it's opportunistic plaintiffs' lawyers. But you can't get there with 400 to 500 pending cases in federal court every single year, and the kind of dollars
that
have been
400 to 500 pending
and
cases?
the kind of dollars that have been spent in managing allegations of police misconduct. So they're wrong, and the data proves them wrong, but I hope that they will come to their senses and get on the right side of this issue.
There was, we've had you on the show several times before, as you know, and one of the things we talked about was the DOJ condemnation, basically, of the collective bargaining agreement that existed, or I guess, until very recently. And they say that they said in their report, the collective bargaining agreements between the police unions and the city have essentially turned the code of silence, which we've talked about many times, into official city policy. The CBAs discourage reporting misconduct by requiring affidavits, by prohibiting anonymous complaints, and requiring that accused officers be given the complainant's name early in the process. Once a complaint is in the system, the CBAs make it easy for officers to lie if they are so inclined. They can wait 24 hours before providing a statement after a shooting, allowing them to confer with other officers. They can amend statements after viewing video or evidence. And in many cases, the collective bargaining agreements also require the city to ignore or even destroy evidence of misconduct after a certain number of years. I know from our previous conversations that these are the kinds of things that you want to see gotten rid of.
They have to be changed. They have to be changed. Again, it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do because the public is very conscious of these and other provisions in the collective bargaining agreements that are antithetical to accountability. And I keep going back to this theme, but these kinds of things delegitimize the police in the eyes of the public when all the other atmospherics are going on. So those changes have to be made. One of the things that's concerning, however, is the supervisors' contracts expired June 30th of 16. The FOP's contract expired June 30th of 17. We have no idea, as members of the public, where those negotiations stand. Have they met? Have they not met? What
You have no
values-
idea?
No,
even
I
as-
have
even
no
as
idea.
Chair of the police
I
board?
have no idea where those negotiations stand. And but it's worse is we have no idea what values the city is bringing to those negotiations. Are they planning to address some of these issues? Now, don't get me wrong. Nobody expects the mayor and his team to negotiate these agreements in public. That makes no sense, of course.
Right.
And frankly, I think there are protective orders or non-disclosure agreements that are in place that preclude the parties from doing so.
Mm-hmm.
But given the heightened attention that these contracts have in the public's own mind's eye, it would serve the public and, frankly, the mayor and the police department for sure to make some kind of statement to the public to give us a sense of what are the values that you're bringing to these contract negotiations. I mean, look, the reality is, going back to the Byrne administration, when these collective bargaining agreements first began, this was basically just a tactical negotiation. Nobody thought of this as there's values here that we want to articulate and codify in these contracts. We're in a very different place now. And for the public to feel like these negotiations are going on in private, behind closed doors, and then at some point a package will be presented to the city council for an up or down vote where no real changes can be made, that is not going to fly. That is not going to be acceptable. But yet the silence is deafening.
I mean, some of this, of course, ties back into the Laquan McDonald case, because that's where we really saw it, really sort of out there, raw and naked. This idea that police officers could confer and get their statements in line with one another and all of that. Do you have a sense that the rank and file police officers believe that those kinds of things really don't work in their benefit in the end, and that they would be willing to surrender some of those things? I asked that in the context of Kevin Graham's election. He was elected with a very, very strong majority in the police department, and I assume that his views represent many of the rank and file.
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly, I mean, he was elected over a different slate, with a very big mandate of the people who voted. What we don't know is how many of those members actually chose to not vote and not participate. And it would be interesting to know, frankly, of the officers of color, how many of them actually feel like the FOP represents their interests.
That's interesting. So you don't. That's something I never thought of. We don't know what the participation rate was in that election.
I don't know. I'm sure it's potentially knowable, but we also certainly don't know how the demographic breakout was in that election. You know, if you look anecdotally, and frankly, what I hear from officers of color is they don't subscribe to the more militant views of the FOP. Look, this is probably one of the most difficult times for policing, maybe in the history of our country. There's a heightened scrutiny, cameras are everywhere. What I hear from officers is they just want to know what the rules are. They want to know, what's my job? Am I going to be supported if I do my job well? Am I going to be supported even if I make an honest mistake and not be vilified? And I think we need to answer those questions for them so they can feel a comfort level in stepping up and engaging and doing their job, which is protecting members of the public. But this vitriol and the back and forth, I think, doesn't help. But I there's this narrative out there that if you're pro-police, you can't be pro-reform, and if you're pro-reform, you're anti-police. Well, that's just nonsense, right?
It's interesting that this is happening, that these two trains are sort of running on parallel tracks here. I mean, you have the reform movement, the consent decree, seeking the consent decree, and it's happening at the same time as these negotiations are going on in private between the city and the police officers or the police unions. So
I would imagine that the Attorney General's office has some visibility into the union negotiation track. They have to, because the two are so interrelated.
Well, I guess that wasn't exactly my question, but it was what I was curious about, because couldn't we find ourselves in a situation where all of these consent seekers at the court come up with some kind of an agreement, only to find out a few days later that, oh, by the way, 80% of that was bargained away in the collective bargaining agreement with the police, and we can't do any of that? And
I don't think that's going to happen. No, I mean, I think, look, the team that's working on this from the Attorney General's office are very smart and capable lawyers. Clearly, one of the first things that they did was look at what's actually in and out of the collective bargaining agreement. What can we do outside of the collective bargaining agreement? I mean, and look, I will tell you, despite the protestations of the union, there's a lot that the department can do that doesn't fall within the ambit of collective bargaining, they don't have to say "Mother, may I" to the union about.
Is that right? Because that is the narrative that's out there, is that the police department's hands are just completely tied behind their back. There's nothing. Everything has to go to the union.
No, there's a lot that does, but there's a lot that doesn't. And sometimes it's convenient to say, well, we can't do that because the union, and make the union a bad guy. But don't get me wrong, the union occupies a big space in this discussion, and an important space. But there's a lot that the department and the city can do that doesn't require collective bargaining. Having said that, though, it would clearly be better if the union was on board with the changes, if the parties were actively seeking their feedback, not necessarily approval, but their feedback, because they do represent a significant portion of the officers on the job. So, but I don't think we're going to get to a place where you have this nice little package that gets presented to the public and then to the court, and then when someone says, "Oh, oops."
By the way,
no, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. Now, again, there may be some areas in which the union is going to object, but then if they intervene as a party, they make themselves subject to court oversight.
Interesting. What if the city is holding really tight on one of these many provisions that we've talked about, and the union just absolutely will not give, and they just cannot come to an agreement? Then it has to go to arbitration, doesn't it?
Well, it's going to go to the prediction is that it's going to go to interest arbitration anyway, which is a little frightening because it's some disembodied person.
It's one person
from somewhere that then has kind of the final say. Obviously, then, in that instance, it's better to get as many agreements up front as possible so that it's not thrown open. But, an unresolved conflicts present risk to both sides. So it's that chess match is yet to be played out, but it'll be very interesting, obviously.
That's been observed before, that as often happens in these kinds of negotiations, particularly with police, that you're just wasting your time doing all this because eventually some person is going to come in and just make all these decisions while both sides sit and wait for the arbitration to happen.
Yeah. But again, I'm hopeful that a lot of this. Look, I think from the union's perspective, and again, I won't speak for them. This back and forth of I have this pile of chits, you have your pile. If you want me to give up something on my pile, I got to get something back for it. That's the kind of transactional process that has gone before. That's clearly got to change, but it's not going to disappear entirely. If the union is very clear and focused on what the city should be asking for based upon the DOJ, the task force, community civil rights organizations that have been demanding change, they're going to want something in return for making any concessions, and that typically comes down to money.
Do we have any sense of a time frame on all this? No.
No. I mean, on the consent decree, if you look at that agreement that was entered into court, September 1st becomes an important deadline, and it looks like there's an expectation that the work will be done by September 1st. And if it's not done by, I think there's another date, I want to say in November, then all bets are off. The cases are unstayed, and the lawsuit can continue.
So there's a drop-dead moment here.
There are some timelines in there that incentivize work to get done and be completed. And I think, again, September 1st, my recollection is the big date. But look, as a
Lisa
practical
Madigan
matter,
leaves office too,
that's
doesn't she?
exactly where I was going to go. As a practical matter, it needs to get done before Lisa Madigan goes. So, with all deliberate speed, frankly, isn't fast enough as far as I'm concerned. But
And there's also the practical consideration that, for all effects and purposes, the mayoral race is already roaring out there. So that will play all kinds of, I can just imagine Gary McCarthy will have a few things to say about
Probably so.
How incompetently the mayor is handling this, and then you just get right into the fight.
all the more reason why it needs to get done sooner rather than later.
Right. Our guest is, as you probably know, Lori Lightfoot. She's the chair of the Chicago Police Board, and she was also a member of the PATF, the Police Accountability Task Force, and she's joining us here on Chicago Newsroom today. It's a little bit of a turn, but not much. We have this roaring case going on with Quintonio, LeGrier, and Bettie Jones, and of course Robert Rialmo, the police officer who shot them. I would imagine that there's no way on God's green earth that you can talk about the case, but I would like to use the case as a way of looking at the process that seems to be going on here, if we can. This is really interesting. The new organization, COPA, is reorganized, and it has new leadership under Sydney Roberts, but I don't think she's actually here yet, right? Yeah. Anyway, it's a completely reorganized board, and it seems to have a very different attitude than IPRA that was there before it. If I remember, IPRA was, I did write these numbers down. How many was it? It found in the cases for 2 out of 300 cases. 300 cases were brought before the
police shootings. Yes.
For police shootings, and IPRA found that only 2 of them were worthy of carrying any further. They found with the police officer. That seems to have changed. Now we get this case, and I guess it would be worth just a quick review. This is the case that we probably all remember with a young man who called in.
He called, his father called.
His father called.
Without either specifically saying that he was suffering any kind of psychological or mental health issues. As a result of that, the call taker at 911 had, at that point, a limited script when there was a mental health call, but in the absence of that information, pushed the call over to the dispatcher. The dispatcher didn't then try to get any specialized units to respond to the call because she also didn't have that information. Mr. Rialmo and his partner then respond, and I won't go any further. Not that I know any of the particulars of the facts beyond what's been reported in the papers, but then what we know at the end of that is Quintonio LeGrier is killed, and as is Bettie Jones, who was the neighbor who was frankly just acting as a good Samaritan and got killed in her
just let the police
doorstep.
in. Yeah.
Tragic.
And again,
Absolutely
we don't need to adjudicate this case. But what's interesting about it is that COPA then heard this case and said that Officer Rialmo was in the wrong and should be fired. That was their public announced decision.
They conducted an investigation. And in, I believe, January, presented their findings to the superintendent, as they are duty-bound to do, and made a recommendation that Officer Rialmo's shooting, use of excessive force, deadly force, was not justified and that he ought to be terminated. The way the process is supposed to work is the recommendation, because it's just a recommendation at that point, is not supposed to be public. somehow it becomes public. And that then creates this pressure for the superintendent. Under the ordinance, the superintendent, once he receives the recommendation, has 60 days to respond. And he can respond to say, I agree with you, I disagree with you, or I think you need to do further investigation this way, that way. There's an extension period built into the ordinance of 30 days, and typically superintendents take about the full 90-day period. Now, what happened is then in late January, a letter that the superintendent sent to COPA claiming that they had not provided all the information in the case, that letter was leaked to the Sun-Times. Also completely inappropriate, completely inappropriate. And then there was some back and forth, I think that was luckily not done in the media, but then about a week ago, the superintendent, it became public that the superintendent had found that the shooting was justified. That finding, which also should not have been public at that point because it wasn't final, also got leaked. Now, I'll come back to that in a moment because I think it's important. What's supposed to happen is once the superintendent makes his decision, if it's in conflict with what COPA has recommended, they have a meet and confer process that's built into the ordinance. And then at the end of that, if there's still
that's the superintendent and who?
And COPA.
All of the board?
No, it's not a board, right?
No,
COPA is a
it's a-
department, and it's got investigators, and it's
yeah.
got the head of it is a chief administrator. Whoever COPA designates should be running point on that. Will meet with the superintendent and his team to see if they can come to some accommodation of their differences. If not, under the ordinance, that dispute then comes to the police board.
To
and
you,
in the first
to
instance,
your organization.
yeah, in the first instance, it becomes to a one-person panel, which is a little bit of a misnomer, who then looks at the evidence based upon a paper review to make a determination as to whether or not the superintendent has met his burden of demonstrating, in effect, that he's right and COPA's wrong. If that doesn't happen, then the case comes to the full board for hearing.
Wait. If it does happen, if that individual agrees with the
then that's the
superintendent,
end.
then it's over.
Then it's over.
Then, okay.
If the individual,
So in this case, just in this case.
and then the individual has to write a justification for his or her determination and then announce that publicly, and then of course it gets posted on our website.
But no, there's no further action.
But there's no further action.
Right.
If the individual agrees in effect with COPA that the superintendent hasn't met his burden, then the case comes to the full board for a hearing like any other case where there's not a dispute.
Now, there are 9 of you.
There's 9 of us, except for the one person then recuses his or herself.
So it's 4-4. It could be a 4-4.
Could be.
Wow.
Could be. Look, my view is if there's a dispute, then it should come to the police board.
Yeah.
But we weren't able to convince the law department that taking us out of having a full complement and an odd number was a good thing. So we have the one person.
I don't know if it's just because I'm talking to you, but that makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, the image comes into mind of the Supreme Court, right? I mean, just imagine that, I don't know, the same kind of situation existed at the Supreme Court, and the luck of the draw was you got Clarence Thomas, or maybe you got, Justice Ginsburg or something, right?
Well, I will tell you, this process has been in place since 2007. And it used to be 3-member panel instead of a 1.
Yeah.
I pushed, frankly, to drop the number down so we would have more of a complement of police board members being in a weigh-in on these very serious cases.
Because there may be several cases going simultaneously.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't have exact numbers off the top of my head, but it's rare. It's rare then that the rest of the board reaches a tie and an impasse. Typically, there's a majority decision, and then there may be dissenters, but the case gets decided.
So I was looking at your composition of your board. It looks like maybe about 6 of you are attorneys, 6 of the 9, or
I think that's about right.
yeah. So some of you are not attorneys. I don't know that means anything, but it really does. It puts you in an odd position because it would seem to me that if if what's being reported about COPA is true, that COPA now has suddenly come to life and is a much more vibrant organization, that there could be many more opportunities for the chief of police to disagree with their decision. So there could be a lot more business coming your way.
Well, the cases come our way whether there's a dispute or not. I mean, we have plenty of cases that come to us from COPA and also from the Bureau of Internal Affairs where there isn't a dispute with the superintendent. But, you know, to be sure, these high-profile, and it's not even the profile of them, police-involved shootings are complicated cases.
They are.
They just are. Because particularly when it occurs on duty. We empower the police to use deadly force.
Right.
Now, you know, with some constraints on the circumstances in which they can use them, but there's a presumption in many people's mind that if a police officer discharges his firearm in the line of duty, there's a good reason for doing it. You know, we have differences about when and the circumstances. For example, if an officer creates the exigent circumstances in which he now feels like the only option is deadly force, is that a justified shooting or not? But they're complicated cases, and they should be. We want to make sure that we get it right. We do justice to the victims, we do justice to the officers, but we also do justice to the system itself. Why I'm so exercised about this leaking of these letters in an interim
to go
process,
back to that.
right, is it adds to a lot of confusion about what is not a straightforward process. It's a little complicated. Most people don't know it. So it just like, what the heck is going on when stuff like this happens? But also, frankly, regardless of who's the leaker, it delegitimizes everyone.
Yeah. And in this case, it puts the superintendent in a terrible position because I'm sure he had very sincere, legitimate reasons for why he disagreed. But to have that floated out in public, it puts him in a position of being the bad guy in many people's eyes.
The nuance and the complexity is never, ever going to be captured in a news article that feels like it's a gotcha story trying to one up. But it also, frankly, a victim family, like in this case, I've met Bettie Jones's daughters. They are horrifically traumatized by the death of their mother the day after Christmas. Imagine what they're thinking when they hear in the first instance from the newspaper that the superintendent has taken this action. It's just wrong. That it should never happen this way. And I hope, frankly, that both sides are chastened and that it will never happen again, because it is not the way that business should get conducted, and it, as I said, it does a disservice to everyone involved, not the least of which is the families that are still suffering from the loss of their loved ones.
Totally understood. A couple of issues arise from both the Rialmo case and actually even going all the way back to 16 shots. There has been a great deal of discussion about whether we could more effectively use tasers or other non-lethal forces. And there's also this thing about it just seems to keep coming up, this thing about the 21-foot rule. I spent some time yesterday just reading around on the internet about it and gotten, it's another one of those rabbit holes. You could spend 3 days on this topic. But is it actually a rule? Is it a law? Does it exist anywhere in any contract?
It's a recommended practice and intended to safeguard.
Is it trained
officers
by the Chicago Police Department? Do they use it in the training?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Because everybody seems to be able to use that to say, well, he was within my 21-foot range.
No, but the rule isn't if they're in 21 feet, shoot them. That's not what the rule is. It's not what the intent is. It's time and distance.
Right.
When you're dealing with somebody who's agitated, somebody who is a potential threat, make sure that you have the appropriate amount of distance so that you can protect yourself. It isn't, now it's 20 feet and however many inches is in my zone of threat, I'm going to shoot the person. It's been as these things happen, been perverted to justify actions that frankly are not justifiable. There's a legitimacy to keeping time and distance. That is a
Absolutely.
core tenet of de-escalation, crisis intervention. All of that talks about time and distance. If we look at, frankly, the videotape of that led to the death of Laquan McDonald, the officers that were there on the scene before Jason Van Dyke and his partner got there were operating from a time and distance.
Yeah.
They were giving him space. The challenge, though, when there, and this is something I had a conversation with somebody recently, is you actually have to allow the time to create the distance to try to diffuse a circumstance. If you don't allow yourself
Because
the
time and distance, they're intertwined with one
absolutely
another.
intertwined.
Yeah.
But if you're like, oh my God, I got to get to this next call, I don't have the time for this, and then you act, you're invariably going to make some kind of mistake. But the 21-foot rule has just been perverted beyond recognition, and as I said, used to justify actions that are not justifiable and frankly contrary to the basic tenet of that rule.
Well, in my deep research that I started and ended yesterday afternoon, I learned that it came from some guy 30 years ago, and that it's really never been seriously revisited, and technology and everything else has caught up. So anyway, we'll let that go. But let's talk though about tasers, because from a layman's point of view, it would certainly seem that tasers could be a really important part of the basket of options that a police officer has.
Right.
And we here in Chicago don't seem to have been doing very well with that. Again,
Doing better though. There's more
doing better.
officers that have been armed with tasers. There's been a lot of taser training, again, frankly, particularly in the wake of the Laquan McDonald case and the Quintonio, LeGrier, and Bettie Jones. The DOJ took issue with how good that training actually was, particularly because it was done in the hallways of the police academy.
You have talked to us about that before on the show. I think it's just important to revisit this a little bit from the DOJ report. They say that in response to the release of the Laquan McDonald video, the city mandated all CPD officers be trained by for tasers by June 1st of 2016. And then they go on to say CPD quickly cycled large numbers of officers through poorly designed training. As a result, officers were not effectively taught how or when to use the taser as a less lethal force option. Many CPD officers told us the training they received did not adequately prepare them to use tasers in the field. One officer told us that officers had been requesting taser training for years, but those requests went unfilled until the city suddenly changed course. And as the way he put it, the city's lack of preparation is now our emergency. I don't know if it's a fair question to ask, and maybe it is unreasonable, but in a case like the LeGrier case with Rialmo, could a taser have bought some time at least?
Maybe. Better though is, this is a complicated issue, but we've got to get to a place where we destigmatize mental illness and mental distress. In the wake of that case, the OAMC, the 911 Center, has completely revamped its training for call takers and dispatchers. They now have a specific script to try to tease out information from callers to determine whether or not the emergency involves a mental health issue. And then you got to make sure that you have enough CIT, crisis intervention trained officers on every shift. And what they were doing before was scribbling down on paper who showed up for work in a particular district and then faxing it over to the OAMC so that they'd know what assets they could deploy. That's of course a crazy process. That's got to get fixed. But I think the city has taken some steps to improve that, but it's something that requires continued diligence and incentivizing, because it's not mandatory for officers to go through the CIT training, and we could have a debate about whether or not you can force that or not, but you have to have enough assets on every single shift to deal with it, because a significant volume of the 911 calls are about people who are themselves or other people calling in about mental distress.
We have talked several times here about training, and I'll say for my own part that while there's no silver bullet, to use the term, the closest thing we have is training. Training.
Absolutely.
Every discussion that we've ever had, there's a component somewhere in there about, well, if officers were trained differently, blah, blah, blah. Now, I understand that you are not in favor of the mayor's $95 million training place out on West Garfield.
That's correct.
Again, the DOJ was very explicit in what they wanted to see in a training academy. They talked about having, I don't know what you would call them, but buildings, like apartment buildings that you could train in, and water training.
A real
and all
campus,
those,
simulate real life
campus,
circumstances.
Right. Which seems to me kind of like pretty much what the mayor has proposed. Why are you not on board with that?
For a couple of reasons. One, it's not going to be $95 million. It's going to be far more than that. Right now, there's only been an allocation of $10 million for the land acquisition. I think that, look, there's no question in my mind that the department needs a new training facility. The current facility
You've said so many times.
Completely inadequate.
Right.
Going back to the tasers, the fact that officers were doing their taser training in hallways, shooting each other across the hallway, and then having to stop every few minutes because recruits were coming through running to do their PT training. I mean, it's not a surprise that the DOJ found that officers didn't feel like they had adequate preparation. So there's no question in my mind that a new facility is necessary. But I have concerns for two reasons. One is that the current plan feels ill-conceived. Talking about putting it in Austin, Imamit's ward by Orr High School, one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. The median income there is $34,000. There's a huge percentage of the population that are receiving public assistance on poverty, high unemployment, lots of folks that are out of the workforce altogether. If you're going to do something like that, make it part of a larger economic development plan to really spur economic development and ownership of that in that neighborhood. Make the building and the campus something that's going to be a community asset, accessible to the community. Bring them to the table, not just their single representative, but organize a community council of some sort, of good people, of goodwill in that neighborhood, to talk about what their needs are, what they would like to see in that academy. There's nothing like that that has happened. And the other challenge is, because of the lack of investment in neighborhoods across the city, not just in Austin, but other areas on the west side, areas on the south side, the investment, the decision to invest $95 million on this edifice to policing in one of the poorest neighborhoods where there's no other economic development going on has spurred anger and dissent on the part of residents in the city, on the south and the west side, all over the city. There's an organized, very organized movement on the part of young people.
Hashtag
no Cop Academy.
Cop Academy.
You know, they're training. They now have a website. They now have a video. They're going on CTA trains. They're talking in schools. You know, people are going to object if they feel like it, but if you actually engage the community in a real thoughtful discussion, and you didn't create an environment where it felt like a zero-sum game, that you were elevating the priorities of the police over the priorities of the people, that's the environment that's been created for this academy, and it sets everybody up for failure.
It's interesting because building on what you're saying, it occurs to me that if the right outreach had been done and you said to that very community, we hear what you're saying about your issues with the police department, and we believe that a good deal of The solution is having a far better way of training our officers. And we would like to build a facility. Would you like to partner with us on that? Would you like to see how, would you like to help us build something like that?
Imagine having that kind of a conversation. Right?
Well,
I just think, you know, putting this facility in one of the poorest neighborhoods of the city without having that community support and involvement and engagement, not having it be part of a larger economic development plan for that neighborhood, is just wrong-headed and frankly tone deaf. So that's why I don't support the plan as currently conceived. It's not too late.
it's not that you're against police training.
Oh no, it's you know, I've been talking about this from day one.
Yeah.
And totally support the concept of a new facility, but it's got to be done the right way.
There's a kind of an echo of the, oh my God, we've got to clear out the riverfront for Amazon. Let's move all the garbage trucks to Inglewood and say, congratulations, we're doing it for economic development.
Yes.
Yeah. But that's a different show with a different guest, I'm sure. Last time you were here, you said that you thought that about 30% of the PATF recommendations had been fulfilled. What's your number now?
It's about the same.
Hasn't changed?
No. I mean, there's progress being made on training in particular. Still a long way to go. They've revamped the use of force order. They're making some progress on putting together an early intervention system, which I think is critically important, but there's a lot of other things that have been left on the table. You know, one of the things that's kind of come up that we recommended and then nobody talked about, but has come up more recently in conversations, is one of the things that we recommended is having a chief diversity officer for the police department. That's something I think that we're going to hear and try to have more conversations about, because I think it's critically important to have a team and a leader looking at everything from how do we recruit, how do we onboard, what are our policies, how are we doing troop deployment with an equity and inclusion lens within the department. I think that's something that could really add a significant amount of value. But there's many, many things that are still left on the table, both from our recommendations and the DOJ, and hopefully many of them will actually get embodied in the consent decree.
In this whole consent decree process. Well, we'll have to have you come back and tell us more about it as it rolls along, okay?
Thank you.
All
I
right.
will.
Lori Lightfoot, it's always just a pleasure to have you on the show, and I'm actually honored to have you here, because
thank you.
you're
It's my pleasure.
You're an important part of the conversation in the city of Chicago. Yeah. Lori Lightfoot is the chair of the Chicago Police Board, and you have been watching Chicago Newsroom. We'll be back next week. A slightly different kind of thing next week. We've got a couple people coming in from the new bosses. Meet the new bosses of the Chicago Sun-Times, and we'll see what they have in mind. Okay, all right, gotta go. Thank you for watching. You can watch us anytime by going to this address, where you can see all of the archives of our shows, and you can watch and you can listen, which is also a great thing to do, especially a show like this. You know, when you're working around the house, just throw in the earbuds and listen to it on SoundCloud. Good thing to do. See you next week. Bye-bye.